Great. So welcome everyone to the Connect and Share this morning. Laurie's tied up in the Outdoors Victoria conference, which I'm guessing is why we're a little bit light on for numbers this morning. So I imagine a number of people will be logging in to watch the YouTube. We've got Adrian Turner here from HR Assured, and we've been chatting a little bit this morning about his presentation. I'm really keen to get into it, but before I do, I've got some news to present on behalf of Laurie. Some good news, which is nice. There's been some grants become available. Outdoors New South Wales, the Christian Venues Association, and Australian Camps Association were working with the New South Wales government, basically to try and make them a little bit more aware of some of the impacts that COVID and the lockdowns were having during term 4 of last year. So the Honourable Matt Keane, the Treasurer, and Honourable Sarah Mitchell, the Minister for Education, and Outdoors New South Wales, Christian Venues and Australian Camps have been able to secure a funding package. There's a link in the chat to that now. And also I noticed that Laurie sent around a pretty good series of emails and social media stuff last night. So it's out there to click on. Applications open early June, and I think they're available to music and overnight camp providers. So that sort of sits very well within our outdoor education sphere. Even if you're not too sure, it's generally worth clicking on and just having a bit of a sticky beak, because often what we find with these things is there's the title is not always as indicative of the T's and C's as it could be. So if you're not sure if you meet the criteria, it's definitely worth getting in and having a look to make sure you are. So without further getting bogged down on that topic, I'm going to hand over to Adrian. Adrian's a senior consultant and at HR Assured and General Counsel. And I noticed that there's a slide on about introducing yourself, Adrian. So I'm actually just going to get out of that rabbit hole and let you do it.
No problem. Were you able to share the presentation?
Yeah, stand by. You guys all see that okay?
We can. All right, so thanks everyone for joining us today. I appreciate that there'll be a number of members that will more likely watch this post-event on YouTube, which is great. We're really thrilled to have the opportunity to talk to members today about the ever-evolving world of WHS and how outdoors-based businesses can navigate their compliance obligations. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with HR Assured and the services we provide, if you just want to pass over to the next slide, please, Hugh. Even probably another one. Thanks, mate. I'm really hoping today's session can provide some insight about, how we as a group, HR Assured and our parent company, FCB, help businesses and particularly SMEs with their HR, ER and WHS compliance, but in managing WHS. Just in terms of housekeeping, please feel free to drop as many questions as you want. I'll have some dedicated time at the end for some Q&As, and I'll endeavour to answer all the questions that you've got. And of course, you'll receive a copy of the slides post the event as well. So before we dive in, yes, if you wouldn't mind moving on to the next slide, mate. So I guess before we get into the meat of the content, I want to just take a short moment to introduce myself and FCB is made up of 5 core businesses, and they fit together and complement each other in providing comprehensive workplace compliance solutions, if you like, for our clients. So those core businesses are FCB Workplace Law, FCB Smart Visa, Enable HR, HR Assured, and QMS certification services, and they all provide something a little bit different. And depending on the need of the client, we have that solution available. So FCB Workplace Law is a traditional employment law firm. In terms of size and resources, it's larger than most workplace relations teams in top tier firms, but it's just a specialist boutique only focusing on ER, HR, and WHS. Smart Visa is our visa solution, I should say, for Australian businesses and needing advice and strategic assistance in migration and citizenship issues. Enable HR is our cloud-based management platform that makes it easy to mitigate risks and manage your compliance through technology. And QMS is the newest business to our group. It's a accredited third-party certification body, so your ISO certifications and training and auditing that they provide. But principally for today's discussion and relevant to members in this forum, HR Assured is our primary offering for SMEs. And this slide gives a broad overview of how we provide those services within HR Assured. So the service is really underpinned by 4 key pillars for both WHS and HR when you sign up for a subscription to HR Assured. So there's a compliance audit, access to the HRA cloud, which is enable HR but with a different code of paint, if you like, and access to 24/7 telephone advisory support through our specialist advisors, and plus in insurance and representation in the unfortunate event that there's a claim. So we offer those services for both HR and WHS, and so we're really well placed to effectively be, for small businesses, an outsourced compliance partner, if you like, and take a lot of the stress around compliance management off small businesses' hands. So a bit about myself, if you want to just move to the next slide. I'll do this very briefly because no one likes talking about themselves. I just head up our safety team, so that's why I'm here today, to talk through and advise you guys on any curly WHS related questions that you might have, and for any members in the future that have needs in workplace health and safety, I'm likely to be the face that you'll talk to in some capacity. So please feel free at any time during the presentation to ask me any of those questions, and certainly after the event, happy to talk to any members at any point as well about how we might be able to help out. So if you just move on to the next slide, please, mate. In terms of today's agenda, we thought it was a great opportunity to devote a session to the area of WHS. It's an area that has more and more emphasis and importance than ever before coming out of the pandemic, and also because we really find that it's often lumped together with HR and ER, and that, in my view, is somewhat problematic because it's very much its own area that requires specific focus and resources in order to be compliant, and most importantly, particularly in a workplace setting such as the outdoors environment, keep your workers safe. So I think, in my view, in order to give proper perspective to managing the main trends in WHS and how to achieve compliance in your industry setting, I wanted to spend a component of today's as really a refresher on the WHS jurisdiction itself, how it differs from the employment relations regulatory framework, because understanding the jurisdiction, the terminology, the enforcement approach of the regulatory bodies is really key to understanding what practical compliance looks like on the ground, in my view. And so the refresher that I'll give will hopefully allow you to take on board a lot of practical pointers about the type of system that needs to be in place in managing WHS in the way that the law requires you to, and how thinking through a systems-based approach should apply in your workplace, and how that system sort of applies to the 3 biggest trends, I think, in WHS at the moment, irrespective of industry settings. And I think that's COVID, psychological hazards, as well as hybrid or remote work. So we'll talk through a little bit of that throughout the presentation. And so along the way, you'll start to get a feel for how the key to WHS compliance is not necessarily about getting too specific about your industry knowledge, but it's more about understanding the frameworks of effective risk management and applying that in your workplace setting. So if you just wanted to go to the next slide, please, mate. I think, to take things all the way back to basics, as I'm sure most of you have at least a rudimentary understanding of, under the model WHS legislation, employers or businesses, or anyone that falls under the definition of what's called a person conducting a business or undertaking, or a PCBU, which is a term I'll touch on more in a second, they have statutory legal obligations under workplace health and safety laws. The most fundamental concept in WHS law is that employers have a duty of care to ensure the safety and well-being of people within their workplace. That's really the primary legal responsibility that overarches everything in the WHS space. and really all responsibilities and obligations fall out of that duty. It's also important to point out, unlike employment law, WHS is governed at a state level with different WHS acts in each state. The legislation is harmonised to an extent, and the vast majority of states operate under the exact same piece of legislation, only that it's enforced and regulated on a state-by-state basis. But even the states, Victoria and WA, that have traditionally done things a little bit different under the legislation, really the effect of the legislation is substantially similar, and the way to think about compliance should not necessarily be divvied up and thought about differently across states because of the different legislation, in my view, if you want to take a practical approach on the ground for small businesses. So the other critical thing that's important to think about is that the WHS Act defines health as including both physical and psychological health. And these psychological issues have come to be referred, interchangeably as psychosocial issues. And that's an area I'll touch on throughout the presentation as well. So you've always got to be thinking about, when you're talking about your duty of care, it's the health of your workers, both from a physical perspective and also a psychological perspective. The law applies in exactly the same way. So just moving on to the next slide. So what exactly is a PCBU? It's a person conducting a business or undertaking. In its purest form, the PCBU is anyone who operates the business. It's usually the organisation or the employer, but it also can be an individual if the individual is conducting the business in their own right. For instance, sole trader, self-employed person. The PCBUs, being the business, if you can think about it that way, they're the ones who have the legal duty to ensure the health and safety of workers so far as reasonably practicable. And we'll get to the importance of that term in a second. But the responsibility to do that is, generally speaking, can be broken up into core duties. And they are, ensuring the work environment, systems of work, equipment are safe and properly maintained, ensuring workers are being consulted with about health and safety matters, they're aware of them, they're being worked through, ensuring the workplace has adequate facilities, ensuring information, training, instruction, supervision are provided, ensuring the workplace conditions are monitored, and that issues that relate to health and safety of people are resolved promptly and in the right manner. So just on to the next slide, mate. Just as important, I think, as the notion of understanding who the PCBU is the recognition that actually every single person in a workplace has responsibility under WHS law or duties, if you like. So there are specific responsibilities for each broad category of people in a business, that is employers, employees, as well as individual directors and senior management, who the law places a significant burden on for managing WHS, and I'll talk about that in a second. But it's important, I think, that we can recognise who is who in our business in terms of workplace health and safety, so that we can properly understand who's responsible for what, and also, unfortunately, where the respective liabilities lie in the event that something goes wrong. So just to the next slide, I think it's crucial, you do need to understand and think about the PCBU, and that the business has that duty to provide healthy and safe workplace for workers, and that's the duty of care. But it's also crucial to understand what an officer is and the consequences of that, because officers are those people within the business who actually carry a personal liability for when things go badly wrong with health and safety. And I would imagine that a number of you sitting here today and who will watch over the YouTube channel would be deemed officers in the eyes of the law, and the ones who have those personal responsibilities. So the best way to think about officers are that they're those people in roles within organisations who exercise a high level of influence or control over the business's operations. They could be the business owner, C-level executive, CEO, CFO, CTO, etc., or managers, senior employees, or people in HR, or really anyone who is exerting that control and really managing the business. And under the legislation, officers have individual duties to exercise what's called due diligence to ensure compliance with WHS obligations. And they're the ones within a business who have that responsibility to ensure the PCBU has put in place appropriate systems of work and, monitor and evaluate health and safety management. I think because of the role and influence that they have, that someone who is an officer has in the shape and running of the business's operation, the law places that responsibility on the officers to safeguard workers' safety, albeit within reason and to the extent that those measures are reasonably practical, like I mentioned before, and which I'll discuss. So just on to the next slide. I think at its core, due diligence is really about safety leadership, and it's taking the demonstrable steps to ensure that the company is in compliance with its WHS obligations at law. And so the Act prescribes that where a PCBU has a duty or obligation under the Act, the officers must exercise due diligence to ensure the company complies with that duty or obligation. So it's really about the law saying, well, the PCBU has a responsibility to discharge its duty of care. The officers, as stewards, if you like, of that business, have the responsibility to ensure that they are doing that on the ground. And the law, goes on to state that officers may be convicted or found guilty of an offence under the Act relating to a duty, irrespective of whether the company itself has been found guilty of an offence under the Act. So it's a really burdensome area of the Act, and quite rightly so when we're talking about the health and safety of people. And in demonstrating due diligence, the Act requires that those officers show that they have taken reasonable steps to do the things that are up on the screen at the moment. And that includes, acquire and update their knowledge of health and safety matters, understand the operations being carried out by the business in which they're employed and the hazards and risks associated with the operations, ensure the business has appropriate resources and processes to eliminate health and safety risks that arise from the work that's been done, and ensure that they have appropriate processes in place to receive and respond promptly to information regarding incidents, hazards and risks, ensure that they use processes for complying with duties and obligations under the Act, and verify the provision of and use of resources and process with respect to WHS. And so I get that is a mouthful, and it may be for a lot of people somewhat disconcerting that there's actually a lot of responsibilities placed on officers. But in the context of a small business, I do think it's really important to just really consider that you do have these responsibilities, and it's about putting measures in place to ensure that you're doing everything that's reasonable within your business setting to protect your people at work. And it's the individual officers who carry that personal liability for it. So yes, in the eyes of the law, these are the things the law and the regulator would look at in the event of something going seriously wrong and there's liabilities attached. But I'll talk about in a second the concept of what's reasonably practical, and if you can just try and filter what officers are required to do through the prism of what is reasonable in your business setting, and always making sure that safety is a focus, and you're doing everything that a reasonable person would think is reasonable in those circumstances, then you're going to be okay. It's not, you do need to have some robust documentation, protocols in place to be able to evidence that you're doing things in the business around this. But stripping things back, it's really about making safety a focus in your business operations and putting it front of mind and making sure that you'd be able to evidence that there was measures in place to protect you around health and safety, so that you could show the regulator in the event that something went wrong. So just on to the next slide, mate. I wanted to touch on the meaning of this term because it's critical that officers and anyone really in who's involved in running the business understand it, because it's the standard in the eyes of the law for how far businesses and individuals need to go to discharge their WHS obligations. So it becomes critical in determining the measures a business must put in place in order to be compliant, because it's really what is reasonable in any situation in terms of what you put in place to manage health and safety is the standard that is always going to be held accountable to. And unfortunately, it's one of these phrases that lawyers love to stick in legislation, so that when something occurs, it's time to decide, what happened and who's got the liability. Only they can decipher it. But jokes aside, it essentially means doing what you are reasonably able to do in order to ensure the health and safety of workers. It means that you need to, if you can, you need to eliminate health and safety risks. And the law says that if it's reasonable to have eliminated a particular type of risk from your workplace setting, then that's what the law requires you to do. But if the risk can't be eliminated, then the law says you have to reduce the risk so far as reasonably practicable. And it's difficult, as I mentioned, because what's considered reasonable in one instance is something that turns on the facts and circumstances of that particular situation. But what is reasonable will take into account things like the likelihood of the hazard and risk occurring, the degree of harm or possible consequences if that risk manifested, the state of knowledge within the business about the risk, the availability and suitability of ways of eliminating or minimizing the risk, effectively what the person in the PCBU knows or ought to reasonably have known about the risk and the ways to try and eliminate it. And after all of those considerations are worked through, it does also take into account the cost of eliminating or reducing the hazards and risks. So okay, we could have done it, but how much would it cost? It's a very last consideration. It's one you could think about last, but it is something that would be considered if the circumstances warranted it. So just on to the next slide, and it's not intended that these presentations are overly scary, or the call to action is around a fear around what could happen to the business if you don't get this right. But in my view, when you are discussing WHS compliance, it does actually need to be done having regard to what is an immense penalty regime that's enforced in this space, and the fact that WHS is actually a criminal jurisdiction. So the sheer scale of penalties that stem from non-compliance can be, the death knell of a business. The maximum penalty for big companies is over $3 million, and individuals who have specific personal duties, who are the officers that I mentioned before, they face up to imprisonment and fines in the six figures. So in addition to the WHS regime, which looks like the regulator in each state who will carry out investigations when there's an incident and prosecute businesses and individuals when there's been a health and safety incident, you also have the possibility for action under other jurisdictions. So things like the Fair Work Act, Discrimination Acts, and workers' compensation claims that arise from physical and psychological injuries in the workplace. They can, of course, be coupled with the legal consequences and the internal consequences that can come from injuries that occur. So unplanned absences, employee attrition, withdrawal and absenteeism. And so I actually do think that, when you're talking about protecting people at work and preventing injuries, as much as you are talking about preventing prosecution and penalties under the WHS framework, you do need to think about the fact that those other jurisdictions are probably more risky to your business, in the sense that you've got employees who, if they suffer an injury at work, can take various forms of action against the business if they believe it's the workplace injury because of the action of the employer. And so you need to think about all of it. When we are here just talking about the WHS jurisdiction, but the control measures and the way you manage WHS actually mitigate risks in the other jurisdictions that I mentioned, because they will hopefully help prevent those situations arising, which can lead to those other forms of claims. And so it's just important to think about the enforcement mechanisms across the jurisdiction. So WHS is regulated by the state-based regulator, for instance, Safe Work New South Wales in New South Wales, and they carry out their own prosecutions in which penalties are enforced against the business. The other jurisdictions outside of workers' compensation, they are jurisdictions in which employees would go and bring a claim against you. And then, of course, workers' compensation is its own scheme that employees can make an application to in the event that they suffer an injury. But it's all interrelated in that they relate to injuries that occur at the workplace. And so really, when we're talking about the mitigation strategies within this presentation, they're mitigation strategies for all of those jurisdictions, whilst we do have a focus on WHS. So just on to the next slide, please, mate. So, what does practical compliance in WHS look like? For me, the starting point that you always need to keep in mind is that WHS law imposes a duty on PCBUs to eliminate health and safety risks in the workplace. And if that's not reasonably practical, that is to eliminate them, then you need to minimise those risks so far as reasonably practical. And I think the challenge for WHS compliance for many businesses, especially small businesses, is that what the law deems reasonably practical will differ in each particular scenario depending on the facts, as I've mentioned. And as a result, there is a tendency or a trend that I see in many small business employers, and they get their WHS compliance framework wrong in one of two ways. They either become overwhelmed by the complexity and work that's involved and never really make an earnest start on setting that up and embedding the system in their business, or they can tie themselves up in knots, in an attempt to cover each and every possible risk scenario, which naturally, impacts on the efficient operation of the business. And really, you can't run a business like that, as I'm sure you all know. And so, really, in my view, the most effective WHS management is managing your risk as simply as possible and reliant on some form of a system. And that doesn't need to be groundbreaking, or complicated. Really, no matter the risk that's being managed, whether it's a dangerous fall in an outdoor setting or a puddle in an office, businesses really need to be applying a version of the risk management framework that's on the screen there. And for a simple framework, it kind of looks a little bit complicated, but it's really not. It's really a four-stage process that I encourage everyone in a business to really get their head around and understand when they're talking about safety. So it starts off, you need to identify the hazards. So review your operations and identify aspects of your work, whether that be tasks, equipment, etc., that could cause people harm. Identify them. Assess the risks that come from those hazards. So understand the nature of the harm that could be caused by a particular hazard and how serious that harm could be, and the likelihood of it happening. And then you control the risks. So implement the most effective control measure that is reasonably practicable in the circumstances, and try and ensure that it remains practical over time. And then you're reviewing your hazard on an ongoing basis and discussing them and consulting with your workers. So it's really about identifying what those hazards are in your particular operations, having to think about, well, what happens if this hazard eventuates? If this occurs, what is the risk attached? Is it something that's very minor? And even if it did happen, not to what it wouldn't necessarily cause any form of injury to someone. And then you filter what you put in place to control that through the prism of what could happen here. So how far you need to go in order to make something reasonably practical depends on what the risk or hazard is that you've identified. If it's something that could result in the death of a person, then quite obviously, you absolutely have to eliminate it from your business, or there needs to be some really, really stringent and robust control measures in place to reduce the chance of that risk eventuating in a death, so that you can carry it out without the risk of a death happening. Otherwise, you simply can't do it. So it's just all about looking at each particular hazard. What would happen if that occurred? filtering what you put in place through that prism. And so just onto the next slide, please, Hugh. So these are, at a very high level, some tips about what a robust WHS management system looks like. And when I'll talk through some of these, specific items, but really what a system, when I'm referring to a system, it is about that risk management framework that I just mentioned being documented and being able to be evidenced and completely embedded in how your business goes about its business. So if you've got, for instance, in an outdoors business, you've got regular safety chats in the morning or that you're setting off on, whatever the activity might be, and you're taking notes about it, and that you were talking to your people about the types of risks that they might see in that day, and putting a focus on health and safety throughout the way you do your business, then that is a system. And it's tough sometimes to explain what we mean by a system, because it can sound quite convoluted and something that's very detached from what businesses do, particularly in an environment such as yours. But it's really just about the types of things that are on the screen, and making sure that you can, if the time came to actually evidence what you're doing about things, you could do that. So, I know that within HR Assured, we have, we essentially provide that system to our clients insofar as we do an initial audit to understand what the business does and where the risks are in their business, and then provide a plan of actions and resources to give the business the resource it needs to be able to evidence that system. And so some of the underpinning parts of a system, the first one, actually focus on creating a safe environment when you're at work. So workers need to feel that they're safe and understand that whilst they are at work, they are always going to be protected by the business, because the business is set up themselves to always ensure safety is a priority. And even in managing the risk of remote work, it means ensuring that there's measures in place to monitor health and well-being of people, check-ins, surveys, etc., and making sure that employees are aware of what's in place to protect them and what the business is doing to protect them while they're at work. The next one, creating that safe systems, again, that's really everything. It's do what things like a risk register. I'm not sure if anyone on the call today would have something like that, but having a risk register where you've documented, well, these are the hazards in our business, these are the risks attached, and these are what we're doing at the moment to control them, is a really effective way of having something to consistently review, that making sure that you're doing those things in your operations. And it's important to have those things so that you can evidence the system that you've got in place in the unfortunate event that you were being investigated or prosecuted. It's a really simple and effective way to do it. And we have our risk register for clients sit in a cloud-based solution, so that you're not carrying around pieces of paper and everything like that, which is just not really functional in this day and age, particularly for small businesses and small businesses that work in a hybrid manner or in a remote manner. So implementing best practice, I should say, workplace policies. It's important to review what policies and procedures you've got in place, or better yet, even as a starting point, ensure you've got them in place. It's an absolute prerequisite. Workplace policies help you determine if your employees have been provided with reasonable directions about how they are to perform work, start and finish times, attendance and trainings, what the business's policies and procedures around different aspects of the operations are. It helps you set out how your business will prevent and respond to issues in the workplace. Regular training and information. Once your policies and procedures are in place, workers need to be properly trained on how they are to work under those policies and what's expected of them in order to ensure a safe workplace. Training for workers in assessing hazards and reporting risks and incidents will ensure everyone in the business is pulling together, which I'll get to in a moment when I talk about the culture. Addressing unsafe behaviour and hazards really early on, part of the culture piece that I'll mention in a second is about addressing hazards and unsafe issues as early as possible again, so people feel it and you understand that safety is always a priority. And the other key one, which is important or really important for a number of reasons, is regular and documented consultation with workers. So on health and safety matters. So the WHS legislation, that's actually a prescribed requirement that the PCBU consults with workers about matters related to their health and safety. And so one of the first things that you'd be, if you were going through an investigation, that the regulator would be asking you is, okay, what happened here, and what was the consultation with workers about these types of hazards and risks leading up to this incident occurring? So it's a prescribed requirement, so they're always going to ask it, and it's just fundamental that you be able to evidence. Again, within our cloud-based solution, we have a consultation tab whereby the client can put in a very short note saying consultation on X date. We talked about this, and these were this was the feedback from employees, or whatever the consultation actually was. It's a great and efficient way for businesses to document their consultation. And even outside of the requirement to consult under the law, it helps you actually identify hazards and risks that lead to issues in your workplace, because your workers are the ones that are facing these risks on the ground. And so it's really important to get a feel for what they think about health and safety, and to take those views into account when you're making decisions about health and safety. And so just on to the next slide, I really do like to focus on this piece. I think it's so crucial with managing WHS. And I know that workplace culture is now a very ubiquitous and almost overused term in our sphere. But when it comes to managing your WHS duties, it's so fundamental to create a positive safety culture in your business that overarches everything, because you need to create something that's proactive and preventative, rather than simply responding to issues when they happen and chasing your tail, because you're never going to prevent them from happening that way, which is ultimately what you're trying to do for a number of reasons, for compliance and to protect your business, but most importantly to avoid injuries actually happening to your people, especially really unfortunate ones. And so I think it's really important to set the behaviour standards in providing a safe workplace. Your culture sets a standard of how you prioritise the well-being of workers and how you're going to respond to issues and keep them safe and healthy. If it's being lived by management, demonstrable to employees, and can be seen and evidenced, you are going to embed a priority on health and safety and a way of doing things that avoids incidents occurring, because people know that safety comes first in the business. And that's always going to be that not only will that help you prevent those incidents, but if you've got documentation, if you've got ways in which you can evidence the way your business prioritizes safety, then the chances of, even if something really unfortunate did happen, the chances of you being held liable for those things are really, really slim, because you've done what's reasonably practical. You can point to all the things that you do and the way you prioritize safety in the business. So it's super important. And I like to think about safety in this manner, in a cultural manner, in the sense that it's prioritized at all times. I think it's the starting point for what good compliance looks like, and it's not an overly difficult concept, particularly with safety. If you can prioritize that, having standing agenda items in any meetings that you have with your people, if you're having talks with workers, safety always being somewhere involved in that and being documented in some capacity is a super easy way to do it. You're never going to be able to entirely remove the chance of injuries occurring in the workplace. They happen, accidents happen, but having an ingrained safety culture and system around avoiding those risks allow a business to be able to evidence that they did have something in place and they did do all things reasonably practical. And so you're avoiding liability fundamentally. And so on the next slide, I think with the pandemic and the lockdowns, the shift to remote work for a lot of people, what we're seeing for so many employees is regulatory changes and legal precedent trying to keep pace with what is now a very different work environment. And they have a strong view on protecting people in that different work environment. And we're now seeing a shifting compliance landscape for employees, and it makes it even more important that everyone is sort of across the new normal with the management of psychological hazards and mental health in the same focus as physical hazards have on a work site. So we know, we talked about at the start, that the Act makes it incumbent on PCBUs to manage psychological risk in the same way that they manage physical risk. Can be much more complex to think about, but that is what the law says. And so there's so much more emphasis now from regulators on addressing these issues, given the toll we know our people have been under in the past. And the government responded to, I guess, the changing working landscape through recent state and federal agreement to include psychological hazards in specifically as part of the work health and safety regulations in order to prevent things like mental health or mental illness, sexual harassment, and other psychological injuries. So just on to the next slide, I think, you see on this slide some of the more common psychological hazards in the workplace. And for most people, I know I do, you probably read that thinking, is there any situation that isn't a psychological hazard? And I completely understand that. What it does, I think, is underscore the complexity of understanding and managing psychological hazards at work, because on the one hand, you've got over demand being a hazard, and you've also got under demand. So it's difficult, it's challenging. How do we reconcile that as managers in creating systems and work? And if you think about a current example, or maybe an example that was more tangible 6 months ago or 12 months ago, but is very possible that we go back to something like this. You think about employees working from home in a lockdown. They're under extreme pressure. They have to continue to deliver work to the employer, keep the business active during challenging times, but they're doing so in an environment, I think, where they're confined to their apartment. They're not having a lot of social interaction. They don't have the ability to interact with managers, colleagues in the same way they have in the past. And this is true of any worker now who works predominantly from home. And so there's going to be hazards from a psychological perspective in the same way that a slippery floor is a hazard, a physical hazard. So, without, I guess, organic control measures that for family, friends, social life, those hazards quickly manifest into injuries at work. And if the business hasn't done enough or fundamentally contributed to that injury occurring, then you're going to be liable, in the same way that if someone didn't clean up a puddle of water on the floor and it was reasonable to have done so, then they are in trouble. I just saw a question come through the chat. I might just have a look at that now. Really the same, to be honest. And a not-for-profit organisation is still a PCBU. So at this, it's really everything we've discussed throughout the presentation applies to non-profit organisations, because they are still, in the eyes of the law, a PCBU. So they are a PCBU. There would be officers of that business deemed under the law, and so the obligations in running the operation with respect to WHS apply in the same manner. So, yeah.
And Adrian, I imagine that volunteers in a not-for-profit, if they're not being paid, would basically translate almost directly to employees.
Effectively, yes. I mean, they are somewhat different, but if you can imagine, in a workplace, a volunteer that was working within the business effectively, albeit under a different mechanism than the employees, and they were injured at work, the law would look at that situation in the same way that if it was an employee. it wouldn't change the liability too much for the PCBU.
Yeah, fab. Thanks for that.
All right, and so I'll touch on perhaps a little bit at the end some of the control measures that you can think about with emotional and mental health issues. But I urge everyone to really sort of think about mental health. And I know that we've sort of driven this point home, but always think about mental health and psychological hazards through the same risk management framework we discussed earlier. It's so important. It doesn't matter the industry setting or what the hazard or risk actually is. In order to manage it and be compliant, you have to be able to demonstrate that there was some sort of reckoner in the business for managing that risk. And so if you have a difficult situation with an employee with mental health considerations, then you need to think about what are the hazards that are in place that could contribute from a workplace perspective to that injury manifesting or getting worse. And equally, what are the things we can put in place to be able to demonstrate that, hang on, these hazards and risks were there, but look at the control measures that we put in place in order to prevent them. We can't and should not be liable in a situation where we were having, daily and regular check-ins with the employee, making sure that they had access to the resources and other support networks that they needed in order to do their job safely. We were constantly reviewing their workload. We were making sure that they weren't exposed to unnecessary conflict. Each situation is different, but it gives you a sense of how you apply that framework. If you consistently think, what is the risk of this injury? What is it? What hazard does it stem from? Okay, let's think about that, and let's talk about what's reasonable in order to control it. That's just so fundamental. It applies to everything, and it applies to COVID, which I'll discuss now as well. And it's just so important. It doesn't matter what it is. You just have to think about things through the prism of that risk management framework that I've discussed. So that next slide, that's right, it's the COVID one. So I think, it still remains the most pressing issue in the WHS sphere at the moment, albeit that, societally, we've sort of, has been some component of us people trying to move on from COVID, and completely understandable. But at the same time, COVID remains, if you think about it, a pretty substantial risk of someone being injured or contracting an illness at work. And so you need to think about the management of COVID from the perspective of it's just a risk. It's a very complex risk. It's much harder to think about how you control COVID and the spread of COVID as compared to, say, as simple as falling off a ladder or slip, trips and fall hazard. But it is still, it is said that they do recognise that the pandemic has created exceptional circumstances, and they have significant impact on the PCBU workers, officers who have the health and safety responsibilities under legislation. So it's an incredibly complex beast with so many variables. But if you strip things back to basics, the business is required to manage the risk of COVID in the same way that they manage other health and safety risks. And Safe Work appreciates that the exceptional circumstances around the pandemic and the complexity of it require flexibility on their part when they're enforcing it. So that informs what's going to be reasonably practicable if someone were to contract COVID at your workplace, and whether or not you're going to be exposed to penalties. They've said that they understand that the public health orders may impact workplaces in an unprecedented way. And so when they're enforcing compliance, they'll take into account those unprecedented pressures. Unprecedented, I should know how to say that word after hearing it nonstop for 2 years. But they'll apply a common sense and practical approach to how COVID might spread in a workplace. And so their actions are going to be proportionate with what was reasonably practical. And so really, you just need to be able to demonstrate that if that were to happen and COVID were to spread at your workplace, will you be able to demonstrate that there was some level of control measures in place to manage the risk of COVID? And so they've said they're going to take that supportive and educative approach in enforcing if COVID were to happen at the workplace. And so they've also said what, in practical terms, those basic things are in order to protect yourself so that you're not going to be held liable if something were to happen. So you're complying with the current national and state public health orders. If you're promoting simple and effective physical distancing where necessary, you're raising concerns about the risk of contracting COVID if it's particularly high in any case. You're monitoring the extent of COVID in your community and sharing updates where required with your workers. You're reviewing your policies and procedures around infection control, social distancing, hygiene, and you are developing and implementing safe systems of work and putting COVID in the middle of that. If you're doing those fundamental things, and if necessary, you can demonstrate it. It's on your risk register. You've got a COVID safe policy. Those basic things mixed with general attentiveness to COVID-19 and its risk in your business, you're going to be okay. You just are, because they are very simple, but they are clearly measures taken by the business to avoid that spread. And if you think about that against the background of what the regulators have said about how they're going to enforce compliance given the complexity of COVID, then you're going to be okay in that space. But you do need to have some basic pillars in place in order to manage it. Okay, so the next slide, where possible, I think, having measures in place when people are working from home, or really in any environment where you don't have the ability to supervise them in a manner you would like, you need to ensure that you've got some measures in place to ensure that they're working safely. And so this applies to employees who are working from home, and it applies to workers who might be working remotely or in some form of setting that presents risk because they're not being supervised or they're not in an environment that you can otherwise control. So, if you think about it simply from, it's probably easier to think about it from a working from home perspective. Can you assure yourself or satisfy yourself that the employee has dedicated space to perform their work? They've got sufficient space. They've got adjustable chairs and ways in which they can work in a ergonomically friendly setting. They've got emergency exits, etc. Basic things like that can be done through forms that you give to an employee before they do any work from that setting, or to satisfy yourself that, okay, this is how you're going to be working when you're working from home. We're okay that's safe, and that applies. I guess the enforcement of WHS is always going to apply as against the risk profile of that setting where the person is working. So if you can think about what's required here to say, right, if this worker is working from home at a desk, and this is how we're going to satisfy ourselves that they're working safely. This is our control measure that we can evidence. Here's the form. We're going to be checking in once every 3 months. Things like that. If you take that and think about it in remote, isolated, or outdoors activities where the risk is far higher for whatever reason, whether it be the terrain or whether it be the nature of the operations the person is going to be doing when they're in that setting, then what's reasonably practical in order to satisfy yourself that they're going to be safe in that setting is much, much higher. So I'm talking here about WHS and working from home. The risks are quite minimal. You do have psychological risks that arise. You do have things like electrical risks and stuff like that. But in a remote outdoors setting, in order to satisfy yourself that you're discharging your duty of care, that protecting this person while they're at work, you're going to have something in place to ensure that there's a proper risk assessment going on and that the worker is not exposed to an unreasonable level of risk of doing what they're doing. So the law, remember, the workplace is wherever that worker is working when they're on company time. So if they're in an outdoors and particularly risky environment, you're going to have something in place. And it's important to always think about these things through the lens of, well, what would happen here if the person was injured and we have to go through an investigation, prosecution, potentially. That's always how you should think about, workplace health and safety, so that you get a feel for the need to have things documented and the ability to be able to demonstrate to an investigator that you did have measures in place. So if you just go to the next slide, please, Hugh. So this one, again, circling back to what we discussed earlier around mental health and wellbeing, again, applies equally to someone who's working from home, to someone who's working remotely, outdoors, or in a different environment than a traditional workplace. They're just some of the control measures you can put in place that, if you can evidence, you can put yourself in that situation, that you can show that you had control measures in place, and you did all things reasonably practical to prevent the workplace being a contributor to that person's injury. So again, this is what are the control measures in any particular instance are going to differ depending on what the employee is doing, the type of person they are, those types of things. But having frameworks like this, regular check-ins, opportunities for communications, or team-based communication, being always available for the person to discuss and listen to any concerns that they might have, and encouraging the employees to stay physically active, and different things they can do in their workday or outside their workday that will promote their psychological well-being are really important, particularly in a hybrid or remote-based work setting, so that you are, again, putting yourself in that situation that you can demonstrate what you were doing to control risks, and make sure that you were providing that duty of care. So if we just go on to the next slide. So again, I'm happy to answer any questions, of course. But before I did, I just wanted to mention an offer that we've got at the moment for members and anyone that will watch this video over the YouTube channel. We are offering at the moment what we call a Whs Health Check. It is effectively a abridged audit, if you like. I mentioned throughout the presentation what we do at HR Assured initially upon a client signing up is to perform an audit of the business's operations to assess their compliance levels and gap analysis, if you like, around what the law requires that the business does, and any gaps that might be present for a particular business, and how we help solve that. So what the health check is designed to do is to be a short form version of that, and give you a top level understanding of what your compliance looks like at the moment as against the law, and a traffic light style report that will say to you, okay, what is your state of compliance at the moment, which will then inform, okay, how seriously do we need to put different measures in place in order to protect ourselves and our people. And so it's a relatively quick process to work through. It'll take about half an hour of time. It's about a $750 consultation that we're offering to do for free for any members and anyone who watches over the YouTube channel. I encourage everyone to do it, particularly because it's free. It's a great opportunity to have a look at what health and safety requires of you, and how much you might need to do in order to be more compliant. So please sign up for that if you have the opportunity to. We'd love to have the opportunity to have a chat to you.
That sounds like a bloody great offer, and we'll make sure a link goes into the YouTube comments and gets circulated for that as well. Thanks very much for that. That's
no problem.
Yeah.
So does anyone have any sort of immediate questions at the moment? I'll stress that again. I'm more than happy to answer them post the event. You shoot me an email or contact me by phone. That's absolutely fine. I'm happy to have a chat with you. But certainly now, if anyone's got any immediate questions, happy to answer them as well. I've worn you out.
You've stunned them. That was
compliance will do that.
Fabulous. Such a foundation level, but a really great kind of overview. It's a bit of a must watch for anyone in the outdoor industry that's filling a sort of a leadership position. Great. I might shall I stop sharing, or have you got a couple more slides to go?
That's it from my perspective.
Great. Let me see if I can manage this without embarrassing myself too much. Anyone online got any questions for Adrian? Well,
Must have covered it all.
Sometimes the slow burn's the best burn.
That's it. That's it. Look, again, I'll just stress, yeah, please feel free to sign up and pass on to anyone who wasn't able to attend today the opportunity to do that. It's a great way in which you can have a look at things that you're required to do and you might not have in place, and make an assessment about whether you might need some additional support in terms of WHS. So please feel free to sign up, and we'd love to have a chance to chat to them.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks muchly for this morning. I think I won't speak for everyone, but I know that there's a few things that are ticking away in the back of my mind that I'm thinking, right, probably perhaps I do need to get in touch, and that great QR code, scan that. And
awesome.
Yeah. So for anyone that is wanting to get in touch with Adrian or HR Assured, we'll be making sure that kind of circulates with the recording. And I reckon we might turn that recording off now, James, if that's okay.